Hello, researchers. This is a short video on the inquiry proposal to help you work your way through this document. It's in two places in our Google Classroom to make it easier for you to find. One is under the prep. So if you were to go to the navigation menu on the left of the Google Classroom under prep, you will find a listing for inquiry proposal. It's also in our week of November 9th to 13th. And when we get to next week, I'm going to move it so that it shows in the week of November, 16th to the 20th. So it is a College Board requirement. But unlike other College Board performance task documents, this one will not go to the College Board. They won't see it. And so we have some leeway where I can actually grade it and give you some feedback on it. So let's just take a look first at the grading rubric and walk through that so that you understand what I'm looking for. So the first thing, and I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger, the first thing that I'll be looking at is your research question, okay? And in order to get the highest score, a high level, it should be clear, feasible, meaning that you've thought about whether or not it's too much for you to handle or within your own scope. Do you have adequate resources to answer that question with your research? It should be significant, and so I should be able to see that you have thought about and identified the purpose of your research question. And then in addition, and with the question, have you set any goals? So for example, if you're creating a policy, your idea is to research a topic so that you can design a policy that would be implemented in an organization. Then do you have that goal set in that research question or problem statement? Also, if you have a hypothesis, so if you are doing a research topic or you're inquiring with a research topic that you think you already know the answer to, do you acknowledge that in your question or problem statement? Okay, so that's the first one. Your rationale. So in your inquiry proposal, you will see it asks you, what are your reasons for choosing the topic? Having already talked to you guys as groups, I know that you all have a reason that you've chosen it, and it wasn't just something random that someone told you to do. So really, this is again kind of looking at the purpose and explaining that in words thoroughly and compellingly as well. All right, so there's a reasoned explanation of how the study can fill a gap. So not just that you've identified your gap, but how can your knowledge fill that gap? So for example, let's say you're doing a study on school start time. And the gap is that none of the schools in Kitsap County have shifted to an earlier high school start time. And yet nationally, several schools have begun to do that. And so your gap is Bremerton High School, but not just because it's easy and not just because it's feasible, but because you believe that Bremerton High School students are achieving lower on their test scores and could achieve higher if we started later in the day, perhaps. So that could be a way to explain how your study will fill that gap, and not just because no one's ever done it before. All right, so data. You don't have data yet, so no one's asking you to state your data. What we want is a description of the data that you desire, the data that you're going to try to collect from your samples. Okay, so a complete description of the data to be collected. So perhaps you want individual anecdotal evidence of someone's mental health, or evidence of achievement or lack of achievement among the junior class related to mathematics. So whatever it may be, what is that data that you're looking to collect? You may want to discuss your sample size. For example, is it going to be all students in the 11th grade? Or is it going to be high school students across Kitsap County as evidenced in social media? Okay, so think about who you're collecting. If it's, let's say, a random sampling of grades among juniors in a particular subject or across subjects, say that it's going to be random. You might want to say that, like, for example, you might have to go to Mrs. Zuber and say, I need some random grade samples from, grades 9 through 12. And how about we pick every 10th student? Or maybe you just want non-identifiable data for a racial segment or demographic. So you'd like to see African American test scores over the last 5 years. So identify what that specific data is, and if you know, the sample method that you're going to use. Okay. Research plan. So the purpose, design, and methods section, right? So you've got to explain, here's why. Am I exploring? Am I explaining? Am I creating? Your design. So is it experimental, non-experimental? And then your methods, is it going to be quantitative, qualitative, or mixed? Please know that it's not just enough to identify them. You also have to explain, right? So if you're going to use qualitative data from interviews and also triangulate that data, as we talked about on Tuesday, with Likert scale survey or some other kind of survey that you're going to quantify, then you're going to use a mixed method because you want a full, whatever that is, a full range of understanding. All right. How does it match your question? So in other words, is your question something that should only be quantifiable data, or is it qualitative, or does it really lend to a mixed method? So just thinking about those different methods and how it relates to your question. So this piece right here, challenges, very individualized. Everyone is going to have challenges. Research is not without challenges. Otherwise, we would have a cure for cancer. Okay, just always go back to that. If research were perfect and if it were successful every time, we would have a cure for cancer. All right, so describe the challenges you think you're going to have. So is it that you're not going to get enough responses on your surveys? Is it the virtual learning that we're in right now? Is it that no one's ever really approached this topic before? Be as specific as you can and don't leave anything out. Just, if you think it might be a problem, write it down. It can't hurt, okay? Because planning for those challenges is going to help you overcome them. All right. Ethics and safety. So the inquiry proposal, when we look at the form in just a minute, is going to ask you whether or not you have to complete an internal review board process. We're all going to complete one of those eventually. Not all of you actually need it. So when we talk about the IRB, which is part of ethical studies, IRBs have to do with human research. So in other words, is it ethical to experiment on human beings? Generally speaking, no, it is not. However, it is okay to interview people when you start to get into some really personal or sensitive areas like mental health. Sometimes we do have to think about, what do ethical questions look like? And at what point are we encroaching on ethical research? So thinking about any kind of approval you might need. So if you're looking at grades, you're going to need approval of the administrator. You're going to need Mrs. Zuber's approval. If you're going to be talking to students about sensitive areas, their sexual preferences, their mental health, then you're going to need approval of an IRB. And that's going to be me and Mrs. Hogue and Mrs. Zuber. And so you would just list that. If you don't know, then we will discuss it and we'll make sure that that gets into your inquiry proposal. So how well and thoroughly you describe each of these sections is going to impact your grade. All right, so let's look at the form itself. I did say this was going to be a short video. I am going to try and keep it short. Some of this is pretty straightforward and we have already talked about it. In fact, it's part of your poster project that you did. You will be doing another one once the inquiry proposals are approved. All right, so this one you've got. State your research question and your project or your project goal. So this could be your problem statement. It could be your research question. It should also address things like your hypothesis, if you have one. So this is pretty direct. Describe 3 key studies. So this was something that you were asked to do on your poster project that have informed your understanding of the scholarly conversation surrounding your topic. So what are 3 of the most important resources that you've got on your annotated bibliography? Okay. Remember, you should be constantly reading and referring to those sources. Okay, annotating them, making sure you know what information you want to use and don't. Here's the question about your gap. So identify and explain your gap. Explain how it's situated into the scholarly conversation. So in other words, studies have been done throughout the nation on how earlier high school start times would impact grade level achievement for high school students. That study has not been done in Bremerton School District, although the topic was once brought to the school board. It was not approved because the research had not been done on a local level. So, talking about, and that actually is a true story, talking about how the research here in Bremerton is really going to add to a larger conversation that has happened nationally, regionally, whatever that might be. And maybe your gap isn't geographical. Maybe it's completely something else. Maybe it's, I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head and I just can't. But maybe it's not understanding how the lack of information regarding, I just had it in my head, representation of a cultural group impacts the mental health of students in that cultural group. So maybe that's it. All right, so I think you guys are going to do fine on that one. Describe your chosen or developed research method. Describe why you're going to use qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method, and defend its alignment with your research question. So why does your question need to be either a mixed method or quantitative or qualitative? Okay. You can look at other studies, other research you have done, read those studies and look at what they have said about this. Why did they choose their methods? Because if it's an academic study, they will have told you. Okay. It will state it in the study. All right, so here are the approval processes we are looking at. So this is the IRB, the human subjects one. If you're going to do one-on-one interviews, you're going to want to check this, and then we're just going to look at it and see how sensitive it is after you write your questions. So you're not writing your questions yet, but once you do, then we'll say, oh no, this isn't really as sensitive as we thought it might be, or this question's a little sensitive. Let's put it through Mrs. Zuber and the IRB and see if it needs to be rephrased or eliminated. Okay. Animal subjects. If any of you are doing anything that deals with live animals, then we would need this. Harmful microorganisms. So let's say you were going to introduce something into a food study or into an atmosphere. If you were going to put fragrances in classrooms while students are taking tests, something like that, something that could cause someone to possibly have an asthma attack or a migraine, that would be something that would need to be looked at. Hazardous materials, if you're doing chemistry research or anything else that might put you in contact with materials that are unsafe or hazardous, we would need to review that. And quite possibly, you may not need any further approval beyond this document. My guess is that most of you are going to need to check this first one and only this first one. Okay. All right. Now, explain how your proposed method complies with ethical research practices. So, how is it that you're going to make sure that your study is ethical? That's what it's asking you. So, if you're going to do surveys, How are you going to make sure that it doesn't cross an ethical line? Okay. Describe the data. We've already talked about this one a little bit. So what is the data that you're going to be collecting? Number 8, how are you going to analyze that data? Are you going to look for certain words and phrases and quantify that from interviews, surveys, questionnaires? Are you going to do observations where you sit in a public area and observe human behavior? Are you going to be doing some kind of content analysis on curriculum in different classes? So what are you going to do? Talk about that and justify that in terms of your question. What are the things you need? Okay, so for example, do you need access to equipment? If you're doing something scientific or chemical, do you need access to a lab or equipment? Do you need access to resources such as grades, anonymous attendance information, anything, records from prisons? People have had to go to City Hall to obtain records on arrests or statistical information regarding crime in our county. So do you need those kinds of things? And then what permissions do you need to collect that data or information? Anything that has to come from high school records from the office, of course, you're going to need information for that. Okay. Now, you do not have initial drafts yet of any kinds of surveys or questionnaires. And so we will put in here surveys, questionnaires, interview questions pending. Okay. And so we will approve it pending review of that. So we're going to say approval will be pending review of all tools. Okay. All right. So that is a perfectly satisfactory answer, in addition to listing any kind of other resources that you would need. All right. Anticipated challenges. So we've talked about that one. A brief timeline. Now, this is challenging, okay? You are going to be asked to prepare surveys, questionnaires, all of that throughout the month of December, okay? So in reality, we would be looking at starting your surveys when we return from winter break, okay? Now, your paper's not due until May, and along with your presentations. So, but we don't want to put it off too long. You need time to write the paper. You need time to analyze your research data that you've collected. So hopefully your timeline will look like January through the end of February. And that way, March, you can spend compiling your data, analyzing it in different ways, comparing it to other studies that you have read. And then March and April would be used to draft your academic paper as well as your presentation, and then get feedback on that, revise it, and redo it so that it's in final form. Okay, so we're not going to ignore that they've given us an extension, but we're also not going to take advantage of that extension. We want to still maintain as much of a strict timeline as possible. So hopefully, when you return from winter break, we will have some surveys ready to go out, and we'll be doing some final review of the wording in those surveys and questionnaires so that you can push them out through whatever process you're going to use and get some responses. All right. This last one right here, anticipated value and or broader implications. So this is purpose. What is the value added? So if you are going to explore representation of a cultural group within, let's say, the art world, then what's the value of that? Is that of high value because members of that cultural group that are not represented are marginalized? Or is the value in that having that representation in the art world would lead to having new artists and young people feeling empowered to add? Okay. Broader implications, right? So Could this generalize out to another area? Are there implications of further research indicated? So anything that you think, maybe you have a hypothesis or you're hopeful that it will show. So I will approve it and determine whether or not it has to go to Mrs. Zuber. So I will use Cami to give feedback and sign off on this. And then hopefully by mid-November, this will be completely done, put away, and you'll be ready to move on to starting to create some tools, which is kind of exciting. All right, so I know this video was longer than I said it was going to be, but hopefully that will help you and you can take your time watching it, or hopefully you did take your time watching it. And I look forward to spending some time getting these done and then reading them. Thanks, everyone.